This is Deepa Merchandani, founder of the Deeply Meaningful Consultancy. Welcome to the Adda, a space for better conversations. This is a snapshot of one of our group conversations with Siddharth Sthalekar, an old friend who's the founder of the Neighbourhoods Foundation, which creates digital social spaces that enhance social coordination, sense-making, and community self-determination. In this conversation, Sid talks about how his experience in finance has helped him rethink what our economic systems could and should be, and how the Neighbourhoods platform can help shape a more equitable, multi-dimensional future. The rest of the conversation was held in confidence for participants to be able to share and learn together freely. Hope you enjoy it. For more information, check out www.deepermeaningful.co/the Adda.
Again, is because of my training in finance and this lens of economics, again, is about questioning the current economic system and also being bold enough to say, can we actually update the economic system? Because it hasn't been updated in about 100 years or maybe more. It's been built keeping in mind the needs of humans from 100 years ago, built using technology that was available a really long time ago. And more importantly, what happens if we actually build an economic system? Or is it even possible to build an economic system that doesn't require me to mute all of these other cultural identities? And what would that look like?
When you look at the kind of context of the last 6 months, the last 7 months, the pressure cooker has been bubbling. And it feels like we've seen the vulnerabilities in our socio-economic political systems desperately across the world. We've seen the vulnerabilities in supply chains, that the supply chains of the West and the vulnerabilities, if you just look at migrant workers and the treatment of migrant workers in India and the supply chain situation. And the vulnerabilities of that and the dependencies to certain markets and what that has meant within the Chinese context. And then you add the planet and climatic change to the mix and the economic system that has been exploitative at its very essence. Can you speak to see when you're looking at your when you talk about economic alternatives and the possibility, within that context, I flip between being really excited and feeling a real sense of doom and gloom. So can you talk a little bit about what you see from the context of catastrophe versus opportunity? Because I feel like I'm sitting with both constantly, and potentially a lot of people in the room are as well. What's your thoughts from when you're putting it into that context?
For the last 20 or 30 years, we've had the benefit of this one global consensus, of this one universal template of what worked across cultures. And you could say that was neoliberal economics, which also, apart from lifting cultures around the world from certain tribal instincts, creating certain feedback loops about global collaboration, I feel like the 2008 crisis, some of the elections of the last few years have kind of shown us that they're running their course. And that's also because, again, this was born out of an economic system that hasn't been updated for over 100 years. And some of these, I feel like this technological process has now taken us to the point where it's actually completely disrupting the way we did things, right? And so in that sense, I do think there is that crisis looming, but I see it as, or at least for the last couple of years, I've been trying to view it as an opportunity to birth something. And so if I were to flip that around and frame this positively, or what keeps me going, is I think what we had was an economic system born out of the Industrial Revolution. So as a result of that, its objectives were solving world poverty and hunger and uplifting some of our very basal material needs. And obviously, using technology that was designed 100 years ago. But I think we now have the ability to move and design economic systems that are way more contextual, multidimensional. And by multidimensional, I mean today as an individual, I don't need, or the current economic system tends to put us into this pigeonhole of sorts. So Sid might have so many different facets and capacities inside him, but that current economic system only speaks to or validates certain aspects of him. Or if he wants to sustain himself, he needs to comply with a certain set of rules. And so there's these fairly monolithic, rigid compartments that we need to conform to, and we chug along. But what's really burning inside of me, and this is my personal experience, and what really makes me tick or gets me really eager to work on what I do, is I would love to see an unlocking of various expressive capacities within us. And what's really in store for us is all of that potential that's hidden and locked up that needs to start finding validation. And I don't think that finds validation in that same monolithic one neoliberal template for all of us, but it finds expressions in networks and groups and communities of people being able to articulate what their expressive needs are and actually finding validation in what's relevant to them. So
then let's talk about the tech, right? Because you talked about the new tech, and how and why this kind of more distributed system can enable this as an economic system that's much more contextualized, right? So whether you call it contextualized or a distributed system, right? Because of the platforms, the whole language around distributed ledgers, distributed systems. Can you talk about, so I'm interested to kind of unpick that a bit. And you talk, I'm going to quote you to you, because that's always fun.
It's always dangerous.
It's dangerous, but you've written in a very interesting article that I'll put in the chat box for the rest of you if you've not read this article that Sid wrote. Industrialized models thrive on holding the technological design sacred in order to generate a stream of revenues back to the owner. Decentralized models hold cultural boundaries as sacred, and technologies may be tweaked to suit the context. It's very pretty.
It's really profound.
it's super deep. But I'd like you to explain it, given everything that you've just said, right? It fits really nicely. Into this idea that it's both tech, there's centralized versus decentralized, but it's also the cultural. But can you talk a little bit about that? And explain what you mean, basically, because
I think there is a lot to unpack there, and I really appreciate you asking this. So let's start at the technology, right? And I think most people around here would have guessed we're talking about distributed ledger technology. Essentially, what they're enabling people to do is maintain a distributed ledger or immutability of a ledger of any sort, right? So in the past, for any kind of information to be considered valid, we required a large institution to maintain the ledgers for us. So if it was land records, birth records, a store of how much money Sid is owed by Deepa, all of this, right? And so you actually had large institutions through force maintaining this ledger for us. And because of the tech innovation over the last 10 years, obviously starting with Bitcoin and that's been iterated upon over the last decade or so, we've now arrived at this place where this ledger can be maintained by any group of people, irrespective of the size of that group. And so the massive disruption here is the fact that any group of people can validate information. And so what kind of information is important to people? Um, is it monetary? Sid gave Deepa 5 gold coins, and therefore, a record of this exists with everyone in the community, and therefore it can't be, can't be refuted. But I think we go one step further, and this is where all of that fuzzy stuff related to culture comes in, because one of the big leaps we have to make when we think about breaking away from global monolithic to distributed and contextual is the primary currency shifts from monetary to reputation. And I'll unpack what I mean by reputation currencies, because we're not trained to think about reputation as a currency. When we use the word currency, we think about monetary, like I have $10, I have 3 Bitcoin, I have 5 bananas. Like these are all monetary currencies, right? But when we move to distributed circles, it's not so much, oh, what is someone saying, but who is this person? Like, can Deepa be trusted? And so everything flows from reputation. And so reputation currencies are remarkably different when compared to monetary currencies, for 4 reasons. Number one, reputation currencies are endogenous. So let's say Deepa thinks Sid is a good film critic. It's inextricably linked with my identity. So Sid, the film critic, can't transfer it to Jeffrey for a sum of $5. Like, it doesn't work that way. Whereas with monetary currencies, you can actually transfer it, right? Like if I have $5 and Jeffrey has 3 bananas, we can actually make that transaction. And so that's rule number one. Reputation currencies are endogenous. Rule number two, reputation currencies are contextual. So if I'm a film critic, it makes no sense for me to leverage that to recommend coffee to people. It obviously means that I can only recommend movies to people. Rule number three is reputation thrives under relativity, which means, is Sid a good film critic, or is Sid punctual? There's actually no absolute answer to that. In fact, I might ask you, well, what context? In what context? In the context of Zoom calls, maybe he is punctual. In the context of friends, maybe he isn't. In the context of Singapore, maybe he is. In the context of India, maybe he isn't. And so it's a stark difference when we compare it to monetary currencies, because monetary currencies thrive under absolutism. So does Deepa have $1 million? Yes. Like, here's the statement. Does she have a house? There it is. Like, you want to be absolutist, whereas with reputation, you want to stay relative. And rule number four is reputation can't be spent, which means if I'm a film critic and I say, go watch this movie over the weekend, I'm not spending my reputation, I'm not depleted at the end of it. I'm staking it. So I'm lending my credibility. And if that recommendation is regarded well by people, my reputation actually rises. And so it's non-zero sum in that sense. So if I have this reputation as a film critic and I'm hosted by communities around the world and I hop from community to community, I actually, as I port my reputation, I'm not depleting it as I go. If it's actually validated by all these communities, it's non-zero sum. And so social capital or reputation works very differently. So I got into all of this because in distributed networks, we make a slight switch, like that emphasis is primarily on reputation, and all commercial activity, monetary currencies, etc., flow from reputation currencies. Whereas in centralized economies, monetary currencies play a central role. So that's a key distinction to make when we're making this leap. And what's ironic about the cryptomania, blockchain hype that we saw over the last decade was everyone was speaking about this move towards distributed economies, but continued perpetuating that same paradigm from the centralized economy. And I think that was kind of stupid, which is why we had these situations in the crypto world where you had a bunch of scams, you had people issuing currencies, but had actually no reputation backing it. And so that led us to some of these problems. So to break it down even further, in distributed economic networks, you don't have the benefits of overarching legal systems. You don't have the benefit of overarching consensus. So when you meet someone, you can't resort to an overarching power that's going to help you coordinate with them. The only thing you have is reputational sense-making framework. And that's super critical. And in the past, tribal societies have done this really well, but they've often had to resort to social fabric of some kind. It might have been religion, it might have been culture, it might have been rules of the tribe, but that's how they maintained feedback loops for positive behavior or what they deemed positive. And which is why this emphasis on culture architecture and this emphasis on reputation currencies in the distributed world, if that makes sense. I can keep
you're blowing my brain as usual. And I've got like a zillion different questions that I want to kind of unpick here, because one of the obvious questions is if you're a film critic and I say you're a good film critic, right? This whole idea of reputation is based on subjective opinions.
Yep.
And my reputation is then determined, or my leverage power is determined by others' perceptions of me. My reputation currency has gone through the roof because we're doing this today and people think I'm associated with you, or vice versa. Is that flaky? Because you can there's conditional biases because there's a says who, right? Then when you're looking within this, you talked about these tribal type of communities, and how those communities are built. From a female perspective, these communities tend to be patriarchal and hierarchical. And there are certain communities, I'm going to put women out there, but there are others that were subjected to not benefit from these. So these neighborhoods that you talk about, or communities, I'm feeling like neighborhood and communities is a little bit interchangeable right now. And you can talk to whether that is really the case. But I'm using them interchangeably. Do those who are networked and have equity and have reputational capital, the ones that will benefit, and for groups that are marginalized and already on the periphery, are we subject to remain so? Or will this help me out because I can build, there are going to be other ways for me to leverage and build my reputation?
It probably isn't a good idea to have attempted this, 4 years ago or a couple of years ago. So I think the only reason we can talk about the economics of neighborhood or some of what we're about to get into right now is because we have agent-centric technology. And I'll unpack that. So Holochain, as some of you, might have heard spoken about in the invite, is an example of an agent-centric technology, which basically means it enables individuals to hold agency over their immutable information, right? And so it flips things around because your land records in the past were held in a data-centric manner, which means the government of whichever state you belong to held those records for you. Or if you are part of Facebook, you're still part of a data-centric environment, which means Facebook says, no, Sid, your data stored at your end is just too risky. Let us do it for you and look at the benefits of it. And so agent-centric technologies flip that around and say, through distributed peer-to-peer validation, Sid can actually store a record of the number of claps he received on his blog post. And he holds agency over it, right? And that's the flip. That's what agent-centric technologies are really allowing. And which is why all of this is even a conversation. So again, what is that information that we're now recording? In the past, they were primarily, because these ledgers were maintained by large monolithic institutions, we tended to gravitate towards monetarily critical stuff, like the house that you live in, Deepa, is worth $1 million. Let's record that information. Like it's worth it. Like there's a monetary value associated with it because there's a huge cost associated with it. And so there was this heavy cost associated with it, as well as the nuance, a lack of nuance in the kind of information that was recorded. So it was only the very monetary critical, like I said. But because of agent-centric technologies, we're moving from monetarily critical to contextually relevant. So let's say Sid has five claps on his blog post. What is the value of that information? What is the value, or what is the point of storing that in a mutable way? To that, I may not have an answer. Like maybe there is no monetary value associated with it, but maybe Ashish looks at it and says, "Oh, that's cool." Like Deepa's clapped on Sid's article, that signals something to me. That's some kind of sense-making framework for me. And so all of a sudden, instead of just recording the monetarily critical, we're recording the contextually relevant. And that, to me, is the game changer. This was not possible before. And so, in a sense, it's kind of one of those inflection moments, inflection points. And I don't want to be too dramatic, but in my head, I look at it as, yeah, that moment when we invented money or fire, like depends on how far back you want to go and how much of a tech bro you want to sound like. But I think it's a pretty big deal. In the past, like you said, we've only been able to record contextually relevant information in social fabric, which, while we might romanticize it, in conversations about community and well-being, etc., was also deeply flawed for the reasons that he brought up. They can be deeply patriarchal, paternalistic, and more importantly, I think they can be deeply tribal. I think one of the conversations that we have to have around let's invent a new economic system is, well, how do we stop it from descending into complete tribal mania? And that's a sign of what we're seeing, right? Like today across the world. And so I think a formal articulation of reputation potentially gives us that new path. And so the difference between a community and neighborhood, in my opinion, and I'm using the word neighborhood with a capital N, uppercase N, because it's very specific naming that we're using, is a community in which reputation has been articulated formally. And so we can probably get into it later, but what Sacred Capital does is build some of this reputational infrastructure. And so for a community or a group of people or a micro network or maybe a bunch of people who like sharing memes, in the past, articulating your culture was really hard. It still is hard, right? Like in the past, we had businesses that we had to operate out of. Like when you go to Facebook, you go there for very specific tools. Like Facebook says, hey, this is how you should be talking to each other. Like, the image and comment, post and comment format. So you go there for specific tools, and there's a generic culture that's enforced on you. So if you have a Facebook group, you can't articulate your own culture. You can't swap the like button for upvotes and downvotes. You can't swap comments for Reddit style threads. You can't rearrange the way stuff appears in your Facebook group based on who should be heard first. Facebook might even censor you if you say something mildly unworthy. And so Facebook enforces this generic culture on you. And in my mind, that is the result of monetization, right? But neighborhoods flip that around. So if Facebook was about specific tools and generic culture, neighborhoods are about generic tools and specific culture. So within a neighborhood, what best represents a neighborhood? It's this shared culture. We value deeply insightful memes. I don't know. Or we value on-point political humor, right? Maybe that's the culture that we amplify, and that's what we're about. maybe we like to have insightful conversations about climate change, whatever. And so neighborhoods have that very specifically articulated. So obviously Sacred Capital like gives you these tools to build these out like Lego blocks. But more importantly, you have to be able to access generic tools. And so I think a good intersection with Gandhian economics here is the example of the charkha, the spinning wheel. For those who don't know, or not don't know, aren't as clued in to the Indian independence movement, because not everyone would or should be. Um, Around the 1990s, 1930s, 1940s, there was this big move pushed by Gandhi and some of the people associated with the independence movement towards something called a spinning wheel. And this was a countercultural move against the large scale industrialized cloth mill, right? And we're all familiar with the textile mill model, right? Like it's a classical factory. But the charkha, the spinning wheel, proposed a very interesting switch. Anyone could contextually tweak that spinning wheel for their context, for the kind of cotton that they wanted to spin. And so you had the charkha was the perfect example of a very generic tool, like easy to access, easy to build, easy to swap, but it could be contextualized, as opposed to a textile mill, which was specific in its tool and had imposed a very generic culture. And to some extent, I think I'm not a fan of Gandhi, but I think some of the economic insights that are derived back in the 1930s and 40s were about economic models that celebrated that cultural diversity, which meant commerce could be woven through that context as opposed to overriding it and enforcing its own friends loving Michael Jordan adoring cultural template on it, right? And so I think that's the switch.
These are the tools. So you've got the generic tools that enable flex for expression, for diversity and individuality. But they're in service of whatever it is I want to produce, rather than me being dictated to that I should be a cog in a production wheel.
I think you use the word in service to, and I think that's exactly what this is. Like, can these generic tools be in service to an existing culture, an existing context, and bringing it back to today's tech? Like today's tech just does not do that. And so one of the reasons why I'm excited about agent-centric tech or technologies like Holochain is they're moving us towards an extremely modular infrastructure, which basically means if you're an app creator or a community builder or someone like you who's trying to drive a conversation, you don't have to build your own silo and your own stack. Like if you were to build your own app, you'd have to build the identity layer, the reputation layer, the data layer, the AI layer, like all by yourself. But in a Holochain context, you just use shared infrastructure. So you're using reputational infrastructure, identity infrastructure, and so your stack is actually really slim, which means as you're building your community, you might reach a point where you say, you know what, I think likes, the way we validate people through likes isn't working. Let's swap that out and introduce upwards or downwards. And I think that's an important feature. You might say, you know what, within this neighborhood, I also want to introduce a chat option. So you're not actually going to another chat app, you're actually pulling out those tools within your existing culture. And so that's like framed back into today's technology. That's a very tangible way in which this will manifest. And which is why we say it's a shift from businesses to neighborhoods, where conversations, commerce, capital, like all of that is in service to that articulated culture. In the monetary economy, we kind of open sourced it out in the way, in the sense that any person who thinks of themselves as an entrepreneur can access capital to unlock some kind of monetary value in the economy. And so in the same way, with reputation, any community or any neighborhood can generate reputation data, but also import reputation data that they think is contextually relevant for them. To your question of inclusion, I don't know how to exactly answer your question. I will be honest. And I think over the last couple of years, there has been this reckoning of sorts and kind of realizing we can't solve all the problems or uplift all of humanity. I think it's also obnoxious to think that you can. And so I think there will be a certain set of people who win in this system. And so the question is, who are these people likely to be? And I think it will be people who can hold multi-dimensional complexity. And I don't think that is an elitist thing. In fact, quite the contrary. I think if you are pretty high up in the monetary hierarchy, your ability to hold nuance and multi-dimensional social complexity is pretty diminished. And so I don't know. I think
Isn't there a farmer example that you talk about?
yeah, there are, and I could like let loose a bunch of these examples.
Give us
I was
one
hoping she'll
of
be on.
your. Give us one
I would.
farmer example.
Well, I think there is a tech element to this. So let's be very upfront. Like, I think there has to be some engagement with technology of any kind. So I think that will be a barrier at all points. I do think that barrier has been brought down significantly over the last decade or so, particularly in countries like India. I think access to a smartphone and basic internet isn't as rare as it was 10 years ago. And so that 21-year-old kid in small town outside of Nasik, potentially who has never been included by the financial system, can actually leverage his social fabric to unleash some kind of idea of his. Like, I think that's like one example. I think there's also communities that we're working with. So there's we've been chatting with this one community called Krishi Janani in southern India, which works with about 7,000 farmers. And one of the interesting conversations we had was one of the limitations of farming in India is that you don't actually have access to resources to go out and get an organic certification because it requires audits, it requires like a centralized party to visit. But instead, what we could be moving towards is peer-to-peer certifications, right? Like, Rajat, you know this, you've lived in Ahmedabad, and one of my experiences of living in the city of Ahmedabad in India is that none of the massive ice cream chains could make any kind of footprint in Ahmedabad. And that's hilarious to me. And that's because like the Ahmedabad ice cream market is just heavily dominated by like women making these really funky flavors out of their households. And I think that is super cool because you can see like it's organized through these beautiful trust networks, right? Like, hey Deepa, like what's like who are you recommending? Like what are the latest flavors? Like is it Derani Jethani? Like that's these are some of the brand names. And people who can leverage that kind of social intelligence win, in my opinion, in these networks. And I kind of like that. I have no sympathy for people who can't handle that social complexity, or who can't handle that nuance.
I'm super keen that we keep the inclusive. Obviously, I mean, I'm completely biased. It's what I do for a living, but the conversations around equity, about inclusion, about for whom and where the benefits lie, and we firmly place planet within that conversation, because we've created a mess and we can't have new economic systems that don't A, recognize it, and B, don't honor that, for us to create something new. So hopefully those conversations will continue, and if you'd like to contact me about some of that, then please do. If you want to create a neighborhood where we make that part of Sid's mission in life, then let's do that too. I think neighborhood's the right term. I'm not sure if I'm still using it right, but there we go. But thank you so much for your time, your considerations, and Sid, to you, hopefully we've moved the needle a little bit further.
So I definitely, yeah, I think some of the questions here and the points raised were unlike what I have experienced in other conversations. So it's always good.
That's always a good thing.